The last time we started with osmosis, we talked about how it is a special case of diffusion with regards to the movement of water molecules. The definition of osmosis is the net movement of water molecules from a region of higher water potential to a region of lower water potential through a partially permeable membrane. Right? So a few things that we covered, first of all, was the net movement. So we talked about how the molecules are moving in and out all the time, but net movement means, right, in which direction is the movement more, and where you would say at the end of the day, so to speak, that the water molecules are moving. So for example, if 4 are moving in and 2 are moving out, the net movement would be 2 molecules moving in. Obviously, you're not talking about individual molecules, but right, the overall movement of water. Right, if the concentrations are balanced, so in this case, if the water potential is balanced, the particles will still be moving, but there will be no net movement because, right, the water moving in will approximately be balanced by the water moving out. Then we talked about what water potential is. So it is a specific term for the concentration of water molecules. So water molecules move from a region of higher water potential to a region of lower water potential, right, along or down the water potential gradient. A partially permeable membrane is a barrier such as the cell membrane, which is permeable to certain particles and not to others, right? So in the case of water, the cell membrane is freely permeable, so it allows water to pass through, but it is selective with other particles, right? It may control the movement or it may stop the movement across the membrane entirely. That's why it is partially permeable. Now, the environment inside the body is aqueous, right? Cells is 75% water, blood plasma is 92% water. Water is a solvent, everything else is a solute, right? And so that affects the water potential. Okay, so we've covered the keywords in the definition. Now, what we want to talk about today is what happens to, I'm going to be sort of brief about this. If you take a look at the text, it goes into detail and sort of repetition. Now, the detail is, right, it's not detail that I would be skipping, but detail in the sense that, you know, gives you sort of a different examples of the same thing, perhaps, and it goes into repetition. So I won't obviously be doing that. So as a summary, right, as in, right, just saw and mentioned that the environment inside the body is aqueous. You've got tissue fluid surrounding the cells. And the tissue fluid has pretty much the same water potential as the cell. As the inside of the cell. And so what that would do is that there would normally be no net movement. Right? And especially no movement, no water leaving the cell, because you don't want that to happen. In this case, where the water potential, right, on both sides is equal, that kind of a solution is called an isotonic solution. Right? Where the water potential is same as the cell. right? And I say the cell because that's what we're talking about in biology, right? If you're comparing two different solutions that are not the internal environment of the cell, but they have the same water potentials, you still call them isotonic. Then you've got a hypotonic solution. Now, this term is not given in the book, right? But it's not a difficult term. A hypotonic solution that has a higher water potential than the cell, right? Which basically means it has lesser solutes and more free water molecules. And third type of solution is called a hypertonic solution, right? Which means it has a lower water potential than the cell, right? Which means it has more solutes and fewer free water molecules. Are, is the difference between these three types of solutions clear? Okay. Now, we're going to talk about what happens to animals and plant cells and these types of, well, in an isotonic solution, nothing's going to happen. We're not going to talk about that, right? You place an animal or a plant cell into an isotonic solution, which means the solution has the same water potential as the animal cell or as the plant cell. Nothing's going to happen, right? It's going to be just okay. So, right, let's talk about an animal cell first. So let me highlight that with a different color to help. Right, and the first scenario is putting it into a hypotonic solution. So when an animal cell is placed into a hypotonic solution, that basically means that the water potential of the solution is higher than what's inside the cell. The book gives you the example of pure water, right? It doesn't have to be pure water, right? It could be any solution with a higher water potential. And so what would happen is, because there's more free water molecules on the outside, they'll move in, because the cell membrane is freely permeable to water. And will continue to move in. It's not going to stop, because the only point it will stop is when the water potentials outside and inside the cell are balanced. And in this case, if there's a significant difference, the hypotonic solution is much more dilute than what's inside the cell. the water will continue moving and it's not going to stop, right? So it's not going to reach a point where it becomes isotonic. And so initially what will happen is that the cell will swell. So it's going to increase in size to a certain limit. And then if it doesn't stop happening, the cell will burst. And that means the cell is going to die. And that's not something you want happening, obviously, inside. Question? Hmm? The water will keep entering. Yeah, go ahead. The, the cell membrane does not stop water. It is, as I mentioned, it is freely permeable to water, right? So as long as there is a difference in water potential, water will move across the membrane, right? Now, I believe the question that is, right, perhaps popped up in your mind is what's the point of having a partially permeable membrane? But you just asked, right, that, okay, what question? So it's not going to stop the water. It does not stop the water, right? It stops or regulates or controls the movement of of around solutes, right? I mean, that's correct. The minerals and whatever it is, they're solutes. So it stops or regulates or controls movement of solutes. How does that affect osmosis? Well, if the cell membrane is stops solutes from leaving the cell, right? That means the water potential inside the cell will be lower. Why? Because the concentration of solutes is going to increase. It's not allowing anything to leave. And so water will enter the cell, right? If the surrounding is hypotonic. Again, hypotonic does not need to be pure water. It just needs to have a higher water potential than what's inside it. Okay? So again, it's not going to stop water, right? But it does affect osmosis because it regulates the movement of solutes. Now, right, that's for the hypotonic solution. The hypertonic solution. So in this case, obviously, you manage to put the cell in an environment where the outside is more concentrated, has a lower, right? So the outside environment of the cell has a lower water potential. And so what would happen is that water will leave the cell, obviously. And it will continue to leave and the cell will shrink. And there will come a point where the animal cell becomes, right, plasmolized. Plasmolized is when so much water, right, so plasmolysis, right, is when water leaves a cell, causing its contents to shrink, right, and obviously and become concentrated. In this case also, so they're becoming concentrated, right? There's no water, and we know water is important for life. 75% of the cell is water. If water is leaving, the activities, the reactions that are supposed to be taking place in an aqueous environment will not occur, and so the cell will die. So in both cases, the animal cell is dying, right? Okay. Now, how is osmosis, uh, right? How, for one thing, in fact, let's complete this talk about the different types of solutions, and then we move on. So next up, what happens to a plant cell? Yes, it does play a role. You're putting a plant cell in a hypotonic solution. Again, that means it has a higher water potential on the outside, right? And so water enters the cell, in particular the vacuole, right? The vacuole expands, grows in size, pushing the cytoplasm and the cell contents, obviously, because they're all in the cytoplasm, against the cell wall. Acha, the cell wall is freely permeable to everything. So not just water, right? It is a freely permeable membrane. So it does not control the movement of any substance, right? Because that's not its role. Its role is structure and strength, right? And so that's what's going to happen now. Now it pushes against the cell wall. The cell wall is strong and rigid, right? It stops the expansion, right? So it does not allow the cell wall to continue filling up with water until it bursts. So if it's stopping the expansion, which basically means it is stopping after a certain point, it will stop more water from entering. Why? Because it's not expanding, it's not allowing more volume or more space for the water to come in, right? Now, this is actually a good thing, right? Because as the vacuole expands and pushes against the cell wall, right? Right? So the vacuole is exerting a pressure on the cell wall. And that pressure is called turgor. And in this case, the cell is turgid, right? How this helps? It helps because it makes the cell stiff, right? Which helps keep the plant up straight. So we know, right, apart from trees, larger trees, the regular plants, the shrubs, the bushes, the green stem plants, the delicate flowers, they're all standing up straight and they do not have bones like we do, like other animals do, right? Vertebrates do. So how do they stand up straight? They stand up straight because, right, uh, if all the cells, and normally that's what's happening, so all cells in the plant are turgid, and so the plant itself stands up straight. So that is why, right, the right have being in the state is important for the plant. And so in this entire thing, we'll talk about transpiration later. So this entire process is maintained because plants lose water, they take up water, they lose water, they take up water, right? And so even in the roots, you've got root hair cells, which we talked about earlier when we talked about specialized cells. So you have root hair cells, right? And the cell sap is concentrated, which means it has a lower water potential. And so, right, it takes up water from the soil by osmosis. Clear? Any questions? Okay. Next up, we are putting the cell in a hypertonic solution. Right? And so what's going to happen is, right, water will leave the cell, the vacuole shrinks, right, as well as the cytoplasm. And what happens is that, right, the cell membrane pulls away from the cell wall, right? Now, because of the cell wall, what's going to happen, right? For example, this is your plant cell, and this black line is the cell wall. And so what's going to happen is, right, this is the rest of the cell inside the yellow border. So the cell membrane and everything inside, right? And so it's shrunken away from the cell wall. All of this, right? It's pulled away from the cell wall. Now, what's happening over here is that the cell, the shape of the cell is maintained. It is maintained because of the cell wall, because that's not going anywhere, it's not moving. But because of the loss of water, right, it is no longer, the cell is no longer stiff, it is no longer turgid. This is called the cell being, right, in this case it has become plasmolized, so plasmolysis. What will happen to the plant? Right, the plant will wilt. So if in the hot weather or a plant that hasn't been watered for a few days, you see that it's, just drooping. Okay, I don't know what is droop here. But if you see that it's just drooping and not upright, straight, and not stiff like a plant should be, right? All the leaves are hanging down. That's because it needs water. If it continues to stay like this for an extended period of time, the plant will die because obviously it needs water, right? Now, plants face the situation, one, due to lack of water, due to obviously, right, hot temperatures, hot weather. But if you talk about human activities, if farmers use a lot of fertilizer, so fertilizer has minerals, and that lowers the water potential of the soil. And so water will actually end up leaving the plant, and it's not going to help. So, they're putting in fertilizer for better growth, but it's actually having a reverse effect. And then in some cases, in irrigation, right, what the farmers do is supply only required amounts of water. So what happens is, if the plant is receiving only as much water as it requires, it will take all of that, but this will end up concentrating the solutes of the soil. And because of that, right, that land becomes uh, cultivable over time, because there's so much salt and minerals over there that you just can't grow any plant. It becomes so concentrated. Any questions so far? Yeah. Hmm. No, like you have to check the condition of the plant, right? If you overwater it, that is also detrimental because that will end up leading to the roots rotting. And if the roots rot, that means the roots are dying. If the roots are dying, then minerals and other substances cannot be taken up by the plant and the plant will end up dying, right? Watering too little, we've talked about that. So you need to keep an eye on the plants and see, what the weather is like, what the condition of the plant is like, and then give them water accordingly. Okay. Now, how does the water balance, how does the body balance the requirement of water? Well, that's the job of the kidneys. We'll talk about that later. Right? So the water potential of the blood is monitored and detected by the brain, and then signals are sent to the kidneys. If there's too much water, for example, you drank like a liter of water, you were feeling very thirsty, so all of a sudden your body has more water than it needs at the moment, and there's no option of storing water, right? Your body cannot store water, so it will take up and it will absorb as much water it needs, or in fact it will absorb all of it, but very quickly, right? It will get rid of excess water. So the excess water is removed, right, by producing more urine. And if your body requires water and you're not drinking enough of it, right, then less urine is produced. Why? Because the body is retaining water and not allowing it to be excreted. Also, for example, if you exercise and you sweat, right, and sweating is a mechanism to, control body temperature and keep you cool. Temperature and keeping cool. Because obviously when you're exercising, your body does get hot, right? A lot of metabolic activity and physical activity going on. So you're losing a lot of water due to sweat. And so you need to hydrate yourself, you need to drink water to maintain, right, your requirement in the body. Otherwise, you will become dehydrated, and that's going to cause problems. Right? What will it do? Your right the because you've lost water, the water potential of your blood will fall. Water will leave the red blood cells. Right? They shrink. They cannot bind to oxygen properly. Right? And so you will end up having breathing difficulties. So of course you don't want to go through that trouble. Also, they mentioned that during operations, sometimes the wound or the cut needs to be rinsed, so they use, right, isotonic solutions during surgeries. Why? Because if they put pure water on the wound, that's going to be hypotonic. That will cause the water from the cells around the wound to leave the cells, and the cells will die. And so you don't want that. You're trying to save the person. So they will use an isotonic solution to clean it, which will have some salts in it, right? And so that way the cells will not be damaged when you put water on. Similarly, you have isotonic solutions in sports drinks or energy drinks. right? So they have the same water potential as your blood, and they also have salts and sugars to replenish what you've lost and what you've used. But you need to be careful to use it only if you've exercised. If you use it if you haven't exercised, then you're just going to gain weight because it has salts and sugars. Any questions? Okay. Now, right, so the last topic for the chapter and for today is the third type of transport that occurs across the membranes of cells, and that is active transport. Now, in many different processes and happenings of the body, you want, right, there is a requirement to move substances against a concentration gradient. What does it mean to move against? Then going from a low concentration gradient, a region of low concentration, so area of low concentration, to an area of high concentration. For example, right, absorption of glucose in the intestine, right, the small intestine to be specific. Now, if we rely only on diffusion, what would happen is, right, glucose will move into the cells of the small intestine up until the concentration becomes even. Then the rest will be removed because they're not required. And so now inside the small intestine, the concentration will be low. And so the glucose molecule will start leaving the cell. And that is going to be problematic because your body cells need the glucose, so they need to be transported away, right? So if we rely solely on diffusion, it's not going to work. In fact, you end up losing a lot of nutrients. Now, remember I told you when we were talking about diffusion that blood flow plays an important part in maintaining the concentration gradient, right? I do believe I mentioned that over here, yeah. But you also want to absorb all the nutrients you've taken in. You don't want any nutrients, right, to be wasted. And so what the cells do is that they use energy from cellular respiration, and we'll talk about that in a later chapter, to move substances, in this case glucose, but others as well. So the substances can be molecules, they could be ions such as sodium ions, right, across the cell membrane, right, against the concentration gradient, right? And so, right, anything that would interfere with respiration would stop active transport from happening. For example, a lack of oxygen, Another example of active transport happening is the formation of urine and the reabsorption of nutrients in the kidney. Alright, so that's another thing that happens. We'll talk about that later. But active transport happens a lot. Okay? It happens a lot in the body. So it's not only diffusion. You can't rely solely on diffusion. Any questions? Flaccid. Flaccid, flaccid is the condition of the cell when it has become plasmolized, right? So it becomes like, just how should I put this? Just a sec. Right. So flaccid is, hanging loosely, limply, right? It's just it doesn't have any strength or structure. It's just hanging. Okay. Like for example, have you ever seen leafy vegetables such as spinach or something that has been kept in the fridge for like 3 or 4 days? When you take them out, they're just like hanging in your hand. They're falling over. Have you ever seen that? They're not fresh. Like the fresh vegetable, they're like stiff. The fresh vegetable is stiff, right? It's like crunchy and stiff and everything. And the older vegetables are like limp and hanging and they're soft. That is classic. So we've reached the end of the chapter, and that's all the book talks about active transport. There is more detail available, but that's not part of the syllabus. Obviously, you won't be going there. So if you're clear on everything, no more questions, we can end for today. All good? Okay, then I'll see you tomorrow, inshallah.